So now we're going to get into risk management concepts. Risk management encompasses a lot of different components. There's a lot to discuss here, so let's get into it. The risk management is defined as the technique or profession of assessing, minimizing, preventing accidental loss to a business with the insurance, safety measures, etc. Meaning that we have various risks that are involved in the organization. We're going to implement various techniques to mitigate that risk. This is coordinated management. It's economically applicable to resources in our organization, and the whole point is to minimize, monitor, and control the probability or the impact of some sort of unfortunate event. Okay, that sounds great. It's very easy to understand, and quite frankly, that's all it is. Very, very simple concept. The strategies to manage threats include transferring the threat to another party, risk transfer, avoiding the threat, risk avoidance, reducing the negative effect or probability, risk mitigation, or accepting some of the potential or actual consequences, risk acceptance. We talked about these four things previously, and that's really what we're going to talk about in detail as we move through this chapter here. The NIST risk assessment process is pretty straightforward. Step one, prepare for the assessment. This is derived from your organizational risk frame. So what is an organizational risk frame? Well, every organization operates differently. And what might be qualified or quantified as a risk in one organization doesn't necessarily apply to another organization. So you need to define those variables for your specific organization before you start to go through the process of conducting the assessment. All right? Once you've identified those variables, then you can move into conducting the assessment. All right? So identify the threat sources and the events. These are threat vectors. Where's the threat coming from? What type of threat is it? Is it a threat against physical property, against personnel, against intellectual property, etc.? Identify the vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions, right? Just because a threat exists doesn't mean that you're vulnerable to that threat being realized. So it's very important that once you've identified the threat vectors, you identify the specific vulnerabilities in your organization based on those specific threat vectors. Determine the likelihood that it's going to occur. Like I said, if I'm a small hometown credit union processing financial transactions, I'm less likely to get attacked, to seize that financial information than, say, Bank of America or Wells Fargo, right? I just don't have the same visibility globally that that organization might have. So even though we might be exposed to the same threat vector, and we might even have the same vulnerability, the likelihood that it's going to occur for me is less than for that organization. What would be the impact if the threat was realized? And all of those things put together results in the overall risk profile for that particular threat vector. That's ultimately the goal that we're trying to define. Once I've done this, once I've conducted the assessment, I can communicate those results to managers and stakeholders and shareholders, and then we can define what needs to be done in order to mitigate that risk. You notice that doesn't say anything about that here, because this is an assessment process. This is not mitigation, it's not acceptance, it's not transfer, and so on. All right, so this is the process that we would kind of define as part of those steps. So the first thing you have to do is establish the context for the risk assessment. Organizational information regarding policies, requirements to conduct the assessment. You have to define your assessment method, which may be driven by policy, or it may be driven by standards bodies or whatever. Some sort of process to select the risk factors. We tell organizations this all the time. Look, you cannot account for every single risk that exists in the domain. It's just not possible, right? You would never be able to come up with a comprehensive security plan to account for every single risk. So you have to define the factors that you're looking for. And it's related to that concept of what is the financial impact, what is the reputation impact, what is the impact to personnel, and so on. So that's how you break that down to its scope, right? The risk assessment process includes the following: identify the purpose and scope of the assessment, identify the assumptions and the constraints within the assessment, identify information sources as inputs for your assessment data, and identify the risk model and analytic approaches to be used. All right. Makes sense? Let's break it down a little bit. The purpose and the scope of the assessment could be mission-based, it could be systems-based, it could be based on regulations. So you might not have an affinity to run any type of risk assessment, but you may not have a choice. You may be regulated by a certain regulatory body based on the business sector that you're in. So that would be the purpose and the scope of your assessment. The assumptions and constraints. Okay, these are the technologies we have at our disposal. These are the personnel we have at our disposal. In going through this assessment, we need to make sure we identify anything that's going to affect the overall outcome of the assessment. Information sources as input for the assessment. How am I evaluating the criteria? Garbage in, garbage out applies here. If the information sources for my assessment are inaccurate or outdated, then the assessment is completely, the integrity of the assessment is useless. Or not confirmable, because I'm not using valid information to perform that assessment. All right. Now the risk model. Risk model could be, are we using a quantitative approach? Are we using a qualitative approach? Are we concerned about finance? Are we concerned about personnel? Are we concerned about information? And so on. So assessment should produce a list of security risks to prioritize the risk level, and then we develop our risk response decisions based on that prioritization. So we have to identify threats and vulnerabilities, the impacts and the likelihood, and any uncertainty associated with the process. So again, even though we might be using a quantitative approach in our process, and we're going to see what that approach looks like in this lesson, but even though we might be using a quantitative approach, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some sort of qualitative function. All right? There's always a qualitative component to risk assessment. It's just the way that it is, because you can't quantify every single aspect. And when we go through the actual methods, I'll talk about that. Okay? All right? The goal is to cover the entire risk space with specific definitions, guidance, and direction from the prepare step, which we saw here in this diagram here. All right. So identify the relevant threat sources. For example, if I'm a military organization, a threat source might be a nation state. But if I'm thinKtank, I'm not necessarily concerned about the Russians attacking me, right? So the threat source will change depending on the organization. Identify the associated threat events based on those threat sources. Identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the threat sources through threat events and predisposed conditions. Now let's break that one down. It makes sense when you kind of read it back, but it's a very important concept, this one particularly, right? Identify the vulnerabilities that could be exploited by your threat sources. The Russians hacking into an email server, for example, through threat events and our predisposed conditions. In other words, what is our current posture that allows for that threat to be realized? Right? Our predisposition. Determine the likelihood that the identified threat sources would result in threat events and the likelihood of success of that particular threat vector. Likelihood is very important to define because when you're prioritizing your threats, generally speaking, you're going to prioritize your mitigation techniques, your response method to those threats based on the likelihood that it's going to occur. I don't have earthquake insurance, even though I live in California, because the likelihood for me doesn't outweigh the cost. And the damage that I could potentially see in the event of an earthquake is not outweighed, is outweighed heavily by the cost of the policy. So, you know, likelihood is a very important concept because it allows you to identify, you know, how you're going to allocate resources to your mitigation techniques. Determine adverse impacts to your operations, assets, individuals, organizations, nation, if you're a nation state, for example, from exploitation of vulnerabilities by threat sources. Impact is important as well. The likelihood that an event occurs is important, but the impact to your organization is important. If, for example, a perceived threat could result in death, a terrorist attack, whatever it might be, that's a pretty high level of adverse impact. And of course, the whole concept of risk assessment is to evaluate your priorities and to identify what you focus your attention on. Very, very important. You may decide to focus your attention on certain aspects based on these evaluation criteria. Determine information security risks as a combination of likelihood and impact. Well, that's exactly what I was saying. Whether it's a qualitative approach or a quantitative approach, very important. What is the risk as a combination of the likelihood that an event will occur and the impact to my organization once that does occur? All right. Ensure decision makers in your organization have risk-related information so that they're informed and that guides their risk decision. You have to make sure that the information that's being provided is valuable and accurate because decisions are based on that, whether it's a financial decision, a personnel decision, whatever it might be. Communicating the risk assessment results, sharing that information essentially drives whatever decisions that your management's going to make to mitigate that risk or accept that risk or transfer the risk or whatever it might be. You have to keep knowledge of risks current because they're constantly changing, right? The impact to your organization 10 years ago is significantly different than the impact or possibilities of impact to your organization today. It's just the nature of things, right? So there's always has to be some sort of ongoing review process to determine the effectiveness of your risk response methods, what your impacts are, and your compliance requirements for risk mitigation. So monitor your risk factors and any one of those risk factors that are identified as critical within your assessment process on an ongoing basis. Understand the changes to those factors over time. Typically, we will see this done, I don't know so much about in the public sector, but in the private sector, we generally will do this on an annual basis. But some organizations, if they're more fluid or they're high-tech environments, they'll tend to do this on more either monthly or quarterly or whatever it might be. All right. Obviously, what you're getting out of this reassessment needs to go back into the whole process of reassessing, and we saw that here, right? Maintain your assessment. meaning basically keep doing the process over and over again so that you can identify changes, right? And update components of your assessment technique. Risk assessments evaluate these things: threats to your assets and vulnerabilities in your environment, the likelihood that a threat is realized by taking advantage of exposure, the impact of the exposure that it's going to have on the organization, the countermeasures that you decide to implement to reduce the threat's ability to exploit the exposures that you presently have, or at least lessen the impact to your organization, and then whatever residual risk is left over. Right? Remember, I told you guys this before. You cannot eliminate risk completely. Not across the board. I mean, certainly you can eliminate risk, by avoiding risk altogether, right? If a Windows XP machine is highly vulnerable, don't use Windows XP. Yes, in that scenario, you can avoid that risk completely. But across the board, there's always going to be some sort of residual risk because you can't simply not do anything. You can't not have anything in your environment. So there is going to be some leftover risk, even if you apply your controls. Okay. So it's really important, and we'll look at different modeling techniques and different techniques for managing these or kind of going through this process, and we'll see that over the next few slides here. Now, there are methods for auditing these processes as well. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, for example. That's a joint initiative, and its general goal is to combat corporate fraud. It was established in the United States by 5 private sector organizations. And the goal was to dedicate or guide executive management, governance, and organizations and entities on aspects of organizational governance, business ethics, internal control, enterprise risk management, financial reporting, et cetera, et cetera. And it defines or establishes common internal control models so that companies and organizations can assess their control systems to identify whether or not they're meeting those particular requirements. The organizations involved, gosh, I don't know if I can remember all these. It's not really that important. I'm trying to remember. I know the Institute of Internal Auditors is one of them. The American Accounting Association is another. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants is one of them. I can't remember all 5 of them. It's not really that important, but as far as the 5 organizations that were involved. But COSO was formed in 1985, and it was sponsored by the National Commission for Fraudulent Financial Reporting, what we more commonly refer to as the Treadway Commission. And like I said, it's those five individual organizations that kind of offer input. Now, the key concepts of this framework is that internal control is a process, meaning that it's a means to an end. It's not an end in and of itself. Does that make sense? Internal control is affected by the people in the organization. Excuse me. It's not just policy, it's not manuals, it's not forms, but it's people at every level of the organization that are implementing policy and enforcing policy. The internal control mechanisms that are in place are expected to give you some sort of reasonable assurance. Again, not absolute assurance, because that's not possible, that that we're managing and controlling the organization effectively. Reasonable assurance, not 100% absolute assurance. And of course, finally, as with any kind of framework, the control is geared towards the achievement of whatever objectives are defined in separate but maybe possibly related categories within the organization. All right. So there is a concept that includes things like effective, efficient operations, financial reporting, compliance with laws and regulations, and so on. And it includes the common frameworks that you would expect to see with any type of governance or governing framework, right? What's the control environment, right? What's the organization? That's going to influence the consciousness of the people and the discipline and the structure of the control environment. The risk assessment component, variety of risks that might exist have to be evaluated. Preconditions to risks have to be evaluated, and we have established objectives, and risk assessment is that process of identifying and analyzing the relevant risks to achieve those objectives, right? The control activities would be the output of that, would be, securing assets, providing for approvals, authorizations, implementing controls, segregation of duties, and so on. Information and communication is a big component because you have to effectively communicate everything that you're learning. And then finally, monitoring, right? You have to monitor the systems so that the quality of the system's performance over time is continually evaluated. And we do that through ongoing monitoring activities or secondary audits or separate evaluations. Another one that's listed here is ITIL. We just call it ITIL now. It came from the term Information Technology Infrastructure Library. But again, it's the same concept. It's just a bunch of practices that are identified for IT services management. So this is different than the COSO concept because it doesn't relate to finance. It relates to IT governance, but it's the same general concept. We need to align our IT services with the needs of the business. There are several different underpinnings of ITIL that are founded in ISO and IEC compliance standards, the International Service Management Standard, and so on. But generally speaking, it describes processes, procedures, tasks, or checklists. They may not be organizationally specific, but they can be applied to an organization. And the goal is to establish integration with the business's strategy, the value, and maintaining a minimum level of competency within that organization. Abad said here, I have ITIL Foundation, and I thought it was pretty good, but useless unless there's buy-in from the organization for everyone to be trained and use it. Absolutely. All of that would apply to just about any standard that we're talking about here, right? Remember that show, You Are the Weakest Link, goodbye, right? Well, that applies when you're talking about applying security. Absolutely. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else that I want to mention about ITIL. Yeah, not really. I mean, it's a pretty in-depth discussion. In fact, we could probably spend a whole week just talking about this concept, but we don't need to get into the details here because we've got a lot of stuff to go through. And you're not going to be expected to know the details as part of your assessment in your certification process. COBIT, the Control Objectives in Information and Related Technologies, another best practice framework. This was created by ISACA, International Professional Association for IT Management and IT Governance. And again, it's just another set of controls over IT, and it organizes them around kind of a logical framework for basic IT-related processes and procedures, right? It was initially a framework that included information and related technologies, but it's been kind of reworked into IT specifically. There is a framework, there is a process description that's involved, there are some control objectives, management guidelines, and finally different maturity models that are involved here. Again, you're not going to have to know the specifics, but the framework is that it organizes IT governance objectives, whatever objectives you might have in your organization, and best practices based on IT domains and processes, and then it links those to your business requirements. Process descriptions allows you to take process maps and map them to areas that include planning and building and running and monitoring your IT systems. Control objectives gives you a set of high-level requirements that are considered by management for effective control of those processes, and so on. So, you know, management guidelines, yeah, who has the responsibility, we get buy-in from managers on agreed upon objectives, we measure performance, we illustrate the interrelationships that brings into the process as well, and then and of course there's always a monitoring component to this. So again, this is another model that exists. ISO 2000 or 27002. That's we'll see more about that in detail with its 14 different areas of definition, I guess. NIST publication 830R1, 839, 800-66R1. Quantitative methods. Quantitative meaning that we can apply specific methodologies that have finite values to allow us governance of public sector information like healthcare, HIPAA compliance, etc. CRAM, another one. I mean, all of these are kind of related to each other. The CCTA risk analyst and management method is basically just breaks it down to kind of 3 stages. You're going to see commonality with all of these, right? All of these disciplines, right? But again, you would drive yourself crazy if you tried to become, you know, versed or understood all of these different strategies. So you have to choose a strategy that fits your organization, but they all end up kind of resulting in the same output, right? The 3 stages, even though it's not listed on the slide here, I can kind of give you, well, it's kind of listed, but let me give you a little bit more detail, right? The stage 1 would be the establishment of the objectives, which, by the way, we saw in the NIST model as well. Define the boundary of the risk assessment itself. Identify and value the assets. Determine the value of the data that's being held. And you do this by interviewing users about the impact that can arise if there's unavailability or loss of data, disclosure of data, modification of data, etc. And then identify the value of the software assets as part of the system as well. That's going to allow you to establish the objectives. And then stage 2 would be the assessment of the risks, right? Identify and assess the type and the level of threats that may affect your systems. Assess the extent of the system's vulnerabilities based on those particularly identified threats, and then combine that threat with the vulnerability assessment with the asset values to calculate measures of risk. And then finally, the third stage, identification and selection of different countermeasures. There are, gosh, over 3,000 countermeasures organized into different groups within CRAM. Obviously, we don't have time to go into all those. But, you know, you talk about all of these different standards and you say, well, I've never heard of CRAM. Why do we use one standard in this group as opposed to another standard? Look, it's not different. NATO actually defined this particular standard, and it was specific for the Dutch armed forces, believe it or not, and corporations working on security like Unisys or other corporations that were involved in global transactions. But it's more specific to those organizations. It's just another risk analysis methodology. And there, like I said, are a bunch of them. Thankfully, you don't have to know all of those, you know, details. You don't need to know all the specifics. All right. Oh, there's a couple more. Gosh, we got a lot to go through here. Right, FRAP, facilitated risk analysis process. Again, same concept, essentially. Same kind of components involved in this process. It's just another method of performing risk analysis. Uses a narrow risk assessment to determine the risk in a system, but it's basically the same concepts. All right. This is where you can kind of get tied down into the minutia, I guess you could say, of all of these different analysis concepts. But you know, it's important to talk about them, but you don't necessarily have to understand the details. Octave, operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation. Carnegie Mellon, 2001. I'm not really going into detail on the rest of these because it's the same detail. Phase 1, build and assess your threat profiles. Phase 2, identify your vulnerabilities. Phase 3, develop your security strategy and plans. So what do you take away from all of this, right? Regardless of the methodology that you decide to use, whether it's NIST, CRAM, COBIT, ISO, COSO, ITIL, whatever it is, Octave, FRAP, they all pretty much have a common thread. What the heck are my vulnerabilities? What are my assets? Sorry, I do that in the wrong way. Number one, what are my assets? Number two, what are my vulnerabilities? And number three, what is my mitigation? Pretty straightforward. All right, and I found this diagram online, so I put it on there because, well, sometimes you need to see pictures instead of all text all the time. It's kind of a useless diagram, though, I realized after the fact, other than the little guy pointing at it. Okay. I don't even know what to say about that diagram other than that. I have the same face that this guy does right now. Okay. All right. Gosh, there's more? Yeah, there are. There are tons and tons of frameworks. And it can kind of drive you a little bit crazy when you're trying to deal with these frameworks. This one in particular is a little bit more well known than some of the others, but it is again another framework. The Security Officers Management and Analysis Project. It's actually if you go to somap.org, there's a lot of great information on that site that gives you different ways of analyzing the threats in your environment. You may be directed by a specific certification in the industry to use a specific process in doing your risk assessment. right? The concept is fairly straightforward. In fact, here's a diagram of that concept. This is the risk assessment workflow. So that's kind of your spanning tree analysis. So you create a tree of all the possible threats to your system with branches of categories like, is it a network threat? Is it a physical threat? The trunk of the tree is basically your organization, and then the branches become the individual business units or technology spaces that you operate in, and then the leaves become essentially the individual threats themselves and the assets themselves. Or you can do value at risk, which is more of a generic way of looking at it. So if we look at a visual representation, well, guess what? Collect the data. What data am I collecting? What are my assets? What are the business units that I'm concerned with? What are the technologies I'm concerned with? What's the threat to those assets, right? What is my vulnerability? Remember, a threat is completely different than a vulnerability. I hadn't mentioned that up to this point, but it's very important to understand. A threat is a general concept, right? I could be bombed. I could be, this server could be compromised by a virus, whatever. Those are my threats. The vulnerability is my posture against that threat. I could be bombed. Well, that's because you don't have the right security process in place to identify that somebody's carrying a bomb, right? So vulnerability analysis is the function of identifying the threats and then specifically identifying your vulnerabilities based on those particular threats. Risk acceptance or risk treatment. These are not really, there could kind of be a parallel here, I guess you could say. Am I going to accept that risk, or am I going to treat that risk? Now, risk treatment could be mitigation, transfer, or avoidance. Those are the three treatment methods that you have. You can accept the risk, which is completely separate than treating the risk, quite frankly. And so there's definitely a difference there. Like I said, the VAR framework is a little bit different, but it's still basically the same steps. What are the threats? What is the likelihood that the threat is going to be realized? What is the value at risk? And that's usually determined some sort of number that you can, that's a measurable value, so that you can identify how much you're going to invest in your risk mitigation technique. Okay? Qualitative risk assessments. Well, there's two things to consider here, and you will definitely be tested on this concept, qualitative versus quantitative risk assessment. A qualitative risk assessment is more, I guess for lack of a better term, it's kind of more of a fuzzy approach to risk assessment, meaning that you don't really have specifics, but you're trying to define risk, and you're trying to define value of assets, and so you can identify your risk posture and how you're going to mitigate those risks. Let's see, descriptive results versus measurable and applied when. In other words, we apply a qualitative risk assessment when these things exist. Okay? If the assessor has limited experience in quantitative assessment, that's funny because, yeah, well, you're going to use quantitative unless you don't know how, then you can use qualitative. Or you have little experience in assessments in general, but they're long-term employees, so they understand the business and the systems involved. So this might be somebody that is a manager, information assurance individual, doesn't have the specifics about departmental operations or technical operations, but wants to assess risk. Very short time because it's not as specific, right? It's much simpler implementation. You have lack of data to contribute physical values or specific values to the qualitative, to the assessment process. And then the methods that are applied are similar to what you would see in a quantitative assessment. Number one, you want management approval. so that you can mitigate the risk. So this assessment allows for that. And you want to, include stakeholders and individuals that are responsible for providing information as part of that process. All right. What are the documents necessary for the assessment? Well, you need your strategy. You need to identify what your information security posture is going to be. You need your policies, your procedures, your guidelines, your baselines, your audits, your other assessments that might insert or might offer input into your assessment process. Network device configuration, diagrams, patching policies, configuration management procedures, test plans. These are all things that could impact essentially how you handle risk in your environment. Okay? What's the software in the environment? What kind of change control procedures do we have implemented? What are the management procedures and so on? Pretty straightforward. I keep saying that, I guess, but it is kind of straightforward. That's why there's so many slides in this material, because it's very detailed. You can go back and read this and understand what it means at a later date. Very important. What about a quantitative assessment? Quantitative risk assessments, those are pretty important as well, but it's more of an analytical approach to assessing risk in your environment. And you will absolutely need to understand this process here. Analytical and a numeric way of performing an analysis. Now, I have always had a bit of a problem with specifically saying it's quantitative, because there is inherently a qualitative process to this. Nothing is 100% quantitative. There is some sort of qualitative component to this, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we break down the rest of this slide here, right? Probability, impact, countermeasure, effectiveness have discrete mathematical values to determine the risk cost outweighs the cost of mitigation. Ultimately, that's the goal in this assessment process. That's really the goal in any kind of assessment, and I told you guys that before. The fix, or the value of the fix, this is the risk. Well, I forget what the characters I was using before. This is the solution. We'll just call it solution. So the solution that you implement to mitigate risk always needs to cost less than simply accepting the risk in the first place. So the goal of this quantitative assessment is to actually come up with a dollar value that we can apply to a particular risk. That's why it says it has discrete mathematical values. The problem is those discrete mathematical values are determined based on qualitative concepts. Again, I'll explain that in a minute. Right? So there's 3 steps to the process. You need to get management approval, the risk assessment construction team, and the review of available information. Again, I'm missing a word there. I don't know why. Okay, so let's break down the formula. The first thing you need to know is the single loss expectancy. Now, single loss expectancy, this is going to be in some sort of dollar value. So each time an event occurs, how much is that event going to cost me? You have an asset value in dollars, and you have an exposure factor. Exposure factor is a percentage, and the asset value is simply the cost of the value. Now, this is what I was talking about. How the heck do you quantify the value of an asset? I mean, if you take something as simple as an Exchange server in your organization, yes, the hardware costs a certain amount of money. Yes, the hard drives cost money. The memory costs money. The time it takes to build the server and deploy the server costs money. Right? But now you're starting to get into gray areas, because there's value to the information on that server as well. You know, what happens if emails get compromised? If information being exchanged through emails gets exposed? Right? Well, there's a value to that as well. So it's not, in my opinion, this is just my lowly opinion, but assigning asset value is extremely difficult to do if you know, if it's something as complicated as a server in your network. You know, assigning asset value to a property is simple. If the building burns down, well, okay, how much does the building cost to replace? But again, you kind of get into gray areas, because what about the contents of that building? All right, how much is it going to cost me to recover those contents? So that's why I'm saying, even though we're using this mathematical, discrete mathematical quantitative assessment process, there's a qualitative approach to this as well. So let's say that the asset value is, you know, $10,000 and my exposure factor is 50%, meaning that when the threat is realized, I lose 50% of the value of that asset. Well, my single loss expectancy in this case is $5,000. Now, that's not the only thing that I need to calculate. I need to calculate the ALE, the annualized loss expectancy. Now, that might be a percentage of the overall SLE value, because maybe 1 out of every 10 years that threat is realized. So now I'm taking 1/10 of that value, as opposed to a multiple of that value, if to say it happens 2 times every year. So the annualized loss expectancy is another dollar value that represents the, well, essentially the amount of dollars that I would expect to lose based on the rate of occurrence of the event and the single loss expectancy. The countermeasures should always be less than whatever the mitigated risk value is. If it costs me $1 million to mitigate the risk, but the effect of the exposure is $50,000, it makes no sense to mitigate that risk, at least not in the way that I would expect. You can accept the risk, you could transfer the risk, maybe at a lesser cost, or you could decide to do different mitigation techniques that don't mitigate the risk completely, so there's a balance. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys or not, but it's an important concept. All right. This is covered quite a bit on the CISSP. In fact, there might be scenario-based questions where you actually have to calculate these values. We certainly see it on the CompTIA tests, where they give you different scenarios, and they have you go through those scenarios to calculate what your mitigation techniques should be, what your risk mitigation techniques should be. Okay. We've got about 7 minutes left before it gets to 1800. I want to go ahead and at least get an hour into this recording before we break for the evening. We're already a little bit behind, but that's okay. Quality, not quantity here. All right. So if you guys can hang with me for about another 10 or 15 minutes, that'd be great. And then we'll wrap it up. Okay. So part of this risk assessment process is to identify vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is different than a threat. It's a very different concept. Vulnerability is an inherent weakness in your system. The threat might exist, but the vulnerability might not exist because you've already done something to mitigate that vulnerability, or that threat, excuse me. So it is a weakness in your system, your procedures, your internal controls, that a threat source can then exploit. Absence of a receptionist, a mantrap, security mechanisms to enter a facility, neglecting requiring users to sign, acknowledge an acceptable use policy, patching or the lack of patching, servers, whatever it might be, right? Generally speaking, most vulnerability assessments focus on technical aspects, but that's not necessarily always the case. In fact, the absence of a receptionist or a mantrap is not necessarily a technical control. That's more of a physical control. Generally speaking, in IT speak, though, we're usually concerned about technical controls, right? So as an assessor, you have to be able to translate those findings into a non-technical audience so that you can convince them to implement whatever mitigation technique is required. All right, so you have to prioritize your findings, you know, identify the potential impact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the stuff we've been talking about for the last 7 or 8 hours or 9 hours or so. Okay? Identify the threats. Different than a vulnerability. Actually, identifying the threats really should come first, right? Vulnerabilities come second. But the threat is a circumstance or event that's going to adversely impact your organizational operations, your assets, your individuals through information systems via unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, or modification of information, or denial of service. Wow, destruction, disclosure, modification, integrity, confidentiality, availability, right? It all comes back to that, the CIA triad. Threat sources could include the intent or the method targeted at intentional exploitation of vulnerable devices or situations, or method to trigger a vulnerability accidentally. Okay? Human threats, obviously terrorists, competitors, loss of personnel, people being fired, people quitting, etc. Natural threats, fire, flood, tornado, hurricane, etc. Technical threats, you know, software is not secured correctly, databases are not secured correctly, physical threats, perimeter defense, etc. Environmental threats, utility failures. Sometimes utility failures can be classified under technical or physical, but generally speaking, we call those environmental. Air conditioner stops working. Yeah, that's kind of a physical thing because the temperature of the data center goes way up and all the equipment fails. Or operational, right? Process affecting your confidentiality, integrity, or availability. That's an important concept as well. Operations. That's a social thing. Just because you have policies in place doesn't mean those policies are being followed. All right? And then, of course, within these different categories, we have lots and lots of specifics related to each of those categories. All right? So we know that risk is a combination of things, right? What's the threat? What's the vulnerability? What's the likelihood? What's the impact? These are the 4 cornerstones of any risk assessment process. Identify the threat, identify the vulnerabilities in your organization based on that threat, identify the likelihood that something is going to occur, and the impact to your business based on that being realized. So likelihood is basically just a measurement of the capability of a threat and the presence or absence of any kind of countermeasure that you would have to mitigate that particular threat. Okay? Typically, we're going to use an ordinal scale. Again, that's not defined as a requirement. You don't absolutely have to use an ordinal scale, but you know, you might classify likelihood on a high likelihood, medium likelihood, low likelihood. It's a pretty typical thing. We see this with the military and you know, national parks with regard to fire threats and so on. But the idea is that this ordinal scale allows you to kind of map a numerical value so that you can compute your risk, and you can prioritize your mitigation based on that computation. Determining the impact is important as well. Just because a threat exists and a vulnerability exists doesn't mean that it's high impact. It could be low impact. So again, this is another ordinal scale that we can use to scale the impact to the organization, whether it's loss of life, whether it's loss of dollars, prestige, market share, you know, all the things that we talked about previously. So here's an example of this likelihood and consequence rating that we talked about, right? Is it very low likelihood? We'll give that an E, okay? Insignificant impact, we'll give that a 1, and so on. Is it unlikely, a D? Is it moderate, a C? Is it likely, a B? Is it almost certain, an A, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is just a suggestion. It's not necessarily a requirement to kind of provide you with a way of scaling during your risk assessment process, okay? How do I qualify the likelihood? Okay, well, skill, ease of access, incentive, resource, total. We accumulate these values to create our total. If the skill to implement the threat or to take advantage of the vulnerability is high, high skill means that there's less of a likelihood, right? Whereas no skill required means that there's more of a likelihood. So we would give a high skill required a rating of 1, no skill required a rating of 5, with the idea that the likelihood increases as the amount of skill goes down for that particular threat vector. Ease of access. Is it very easy to do? Is it very difficult to do? Incentive, right? Like I said, I've done this a few times. Small bank might be less likely to be compromised than a large bank just because there's more incentive for a large bank, right? Whether it's reputation or dollars or whatever it might be. The resources that are required. Do you have to have vast amount of computing resources or personnel to affect a threat, or is it very simple? In other words, is there a single point of entry? Do I have to have a huge botnet to facilitate the threat? So based on this, and again, this is just a suggestion, based on this, because we have 4 input variables, we take our ratings, whether it's 5, say a 5 here, and a 3 here, and a 2 here, and a 4 here. We add all those up, and we divide by 4, and that's how we get these individual classifications, right? 1 is an E, 2 is a D, 3 is a C, 4 is a B, 5 is an A, and that's how we got those classifications, okay? So, and again, just a suggestion or recommendation on how to maybe consider or look at these different threats in your environment, okay? So this is where we're going to pause on this video because otherwise the video would be about 3 or 4 hours long, and we'll pick up in the morning the rest of this particular lesson, okay?